Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai hoki mai ki Branching Out, our podcast focused on Indigenous forests and Indigenous forestry in Aotearoa. This week we're back with Scion Emeritus scientist Greg Steward. Morena, Greg. Thank you for coming in again. Today we're going to be talking about establishment, which is a pretty important process in the planting life cycle. So I just want to jump straight into it and ask you, can you explain a little bit about what establishment means from a science perspective?
Well, establishment really is the human intervention in the beginnings of a native forest. It's really the active engagement in deciding what species to plant, where to plant, how to plant, and why to plant. So it shortcuts the natural ecosystem approach to restoration or return of mahi to the land, and it suggests that you have an outcome in mind that you're pursuing. The ecosystem approach, you're talking really potentially decades between a piece of bare land where forest has been removed from and the return of any emergent forest. And that's really dictated by where you are, the type of climate and the availability of a seed source, and then the mechanisms of dispersal of that seed. So in some instances, you might get bracken fern overtake a site, or something like gorse or some other species that takes advantage. But what you're doing with establishment is saying, like, I'm going to put a rako back on that site and I'm going to do that for a particular purpose and then deliberately go out and make some choices and put some actions into place.
Yeah, okay. Going back to what you said, finding your seed source, how do you find good seeds and how do we know that they're good seeds?
Depending on the outcome, good seed is anything that will germinate or anything that is able to be collected. And that's one of the biggest problems with, I guess, in Indigenous forestry or Indigenous plantations, is finding seed at the time that you want or need it. I've been collecting seed or had collected seed for decades, and there are times when you would go through whole seasons of seed collection where virtually nothing was viable. There was no embryo within that seed because it hadn't been pollinated. And that might be that the climate conditions at the time of pollen release didn't favour it. You might have got wind that carried the pollen out to sea. There weren't enough birds or insects around, or it could have been a major rain event afterwards and washed the pollen rather down onto the ground. There's a number of things that occur that can create poor seed or poor seed germination. So what you're really looking for is a good fat seed. If you're familiar with what seed looks like for the particular species you're trying to work with, you're looking for good solid seed, and particularly from a number of parent plants, so that you don't just concentrate, oh look, that tree over there has got a ton of seed on it, so I'll collect all that and I'll take it to my nursery and grow it. Well, you're only replicating either one, maybe two parents at the most. So your whole planting program after that is very narrow in terms of what it might achieve. But usually what we would do would be to collect seed, bring it back to the nursery, and then we would cut a selection of that seed, cut it in half and see if there was an embryo inside. And then on the basis of that, would say, oh yes, okay, that's quite good. And we'll store that through to around spring and then sow it and germinate it.
Oh yeah, okay. I guess that's one way to do it. I think I've seen some people doing sort of like a bit of a float test where they, put the seed in water and see what floats and what sinks, and often stuff that's floating is seen as not viable, but I think it might be species specific for that. Have you ever done that one?
I've never done that myself. Yeah, I have heard of it, but I think you're right. It will be very species specific. Quite heavy seed will probably generally either sink or float below the surface, and it'll give you a bit of an inconclusive result.
Yeah.
It's better to see if there's actually an embryo inside the seed. And I've been through whole seasons where we've cut seed and there's been no embryo in any of the species in any of the seed, which kind of suggests that we have not so much wasted our time, but nature is doing something a little bit different to what we would kind of hope it would. So we're working from natural stands, natural plants out in the wild or in parks and reserves. We have done that in the past. We're not working from plantation breeding programs where we have a reasonable certainty around what's going on with individual parents.
Yeah, where you've sort of got that population that's kind of made for collecting seed, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And collecting seed is expensive. So if you send 2 or 3 people out for a week to collect seed, as we did, and you come back with a good collection, that's quite well worth it. But if you come back with nothing, that's a week's worth of wages for those people and vehicles and what have you, that has got to be incorporated into your seedlings.
So, thinking about collecting seed and, I guess going to the methods of collecting seed, some of these trees are really, really, really tall.
Yep.
Are they all climbed? Do you ever get helicopters in? Do you use shotguns? Like, what are some of the methods of collecting seed from really tall trees?
What we used to do was to go out into where we used to collect seed from relatively regularly. And after a while, you knew places where to go. That would give you an indication. So we'd go out towards late summer and just have a day or two having a look around and see what the seed season looked like. It was how it might be developing. So there's a lot of flowers, a lot of young seed being produced on the plants, and we knew where to go back to from there. For shrubs and smaller species, we could collect sometimes the likes of the Cuprospis, the karamu and others. If we found branches that were absolutely laden with seed and we knew that they would be replaced, those branches would be replaced in the next growing season, we'd cut branches off, bring them back to the nursery, and we'd do all the stripping and collection there in the nursery. For taller trees, some of the hardwood trees, the hinu, the koikoi, the pururi, we'd be looking on the ground or for lower branches, see if we could collect directly either from the tree itself, from low-hanging branches, or from the ground. So if we were trying to collect from the tall trees, the likes of the rimu, matai, kakatea, generally we would go in and look for seed on the ground. So after the time that we thought that the seed should have ripened and fallen, we would then look to collect seed directly off the ground. Sometimes there were some very novel ways of doing it. We had a very good seed season once of rimu in the 1970s, and we had a generator and a vacuum cleaner, and we were vacuuming rimu seed off the road and off walking tracks. Looked very peculiar for people passing by, but it was a good, quick way of collecting seed.
Yeah, that's that work smarter, not harder.
Yeah. The other way was to, where we couldn't do that, or we hadn't thought to take that sort of machinery out with us, we would rake up the loose duff off the ground, and we would bring that in with the idea of sieving out the larger pieces and then sowing that duff onto a nursery bed. And the advantage of that was that if the target species would be the tree that was directly above you, but what you didn't know was what else had fallen into that duff from either birds or been blown in. So quite often you would pick up other species once things started to germinate, and you were able to tease those out and pull those away to grow on as another seed lot. So that was one way of doing it. The likes of Aotearoa and Kōri and other species that are wind distributed, you're often looking to collect seed before it falls because it's very hard to find on the ground. It's really just a small brown seed with a little brown wing on it and could be 10, 20, 30, 100 metres from the parent tree. So collecting Kōri is a bit of a sort of a one-off type of collection method where you probably, particularly if you're trying to pursue parent lines, you're wanting to climb trees to collect cones before they start to disintegrate. And that's a window of opportunity that probably lasts no more than a couple of weeks.
Yeah, because once I've picked up Kōri cones from the ground before, and they've literally just absolutely fallen apart in my hand just as you can't even actually pick it up. It just falls apart as you pick it up.
Yeah. But again, it's like with other species. You've got to make sure that you don't go in too early, get too excited and go in and start collecting immature seed because it may not mature on in your storage.
Yeah, because with Kōri, you've got your year 1 and your year 2 cones, don't you?
Yes. Yep. So a mature Kōri cone will be about the size of a small tennis ball. And a cone that's coming on from maturity for the following season will be smaller than a golf ball.
Mm. Oh, well, that's pretty easy to tell then.
Yeah. If it's too small, it's likely that it may not have even been pollinated. It may be still developing to be pollinated in the following spring.
So I guess if we're thinking about, collecting seed and then germinating them, what does a good seedling look like for establishment? What kind of root system does it have? What does the foliage look like? And maybe just, for example, we could think about Kōri or Tōtaro or Rimu.
Naming those three species is actually quite interesting because they have quite different characteristics in the nursery. A good Kōri seedling will be somewhere around about 50 centimetres to maybe 75 centimetres tall. It should be up to around about a centimetre at the root collar, and the root collar is where the stem of the plant meets the potting mix. The pot itself, you're likely to have something like a PP3 planter bag from your standard nursery. If you pick up the pot, pick it up by the side of the pot, not by grabbing the seedling itself. Pick the pot up, just give it some gentle squeeze. If it deforms and springs back a little bit, then it's probably got a good quantity of roots inside there. If you squeeze it and the whole thing looks like it's about ready to fall apart,
Does it reshape?
it's probably that the roots haven't fully been taken up into that space, and it may be that the root system is too small for the top. That's evident. And if you squeeze it and it doesn't move, it's probably pot bound, particularly if you find that roots are coming out the bottom of the pot. And if the pot's been held on the ground and the roots have entered the soil below where it's sitting on the ground, then you've got a fair idea that it's been there for a while, and how you would deal with that would depend on what you want to do with that seedling, what it's supposed to represent. Is it a plantation? Then it's probably not a good seedling. If it's just a restoration, then you can probably plant it and let it look after itself.
Has that got anything to do with sort of that root ball effect?
It can do. It can be a reflection of maybe the genetics of the plant, or how well the nursery is getting rid of plants out of its gates during the planting season. So it might be that this is an end-of-line seedling from last year. It's been held over, watered and fed again, and then the root systems have really filled the bag up and kind of overfilled it. The plants become root-bound. And particularly with Kōrero, they tend to not have very good fibrous root systems. They tend to be quite a woody root system, as opposed to Kumu and Aotearoa, which tend to have very good fibrous root systems. Now, they can be a little bit skinnier for the reflections of a good seedling. But again, about 50 to 75 centimetres tall is an ideal height. What you don't want is to have seedlings that have been crammed together in small pots in the nursery, where they've been forced to grow up and become very thin and root systems are very small. They look okay in the nursery. That's because everything is artificially supplied to them. All their water supplied, all their nutrients are supplied. But when you take a seedling like that out and you plant it, it tends to dehydrate a little bit. It flops over. Weeds growing around tend to overcome it, and you can get suppression and or mortality because of it. So concentrate on nice looking seedlings, but make sure that the pot size that they're in reflects, I guess, what the top is. You don't want a tall seedling with a small pot, small root system, because it's going to struggle to look after itself when it gets there. But if you're growing on contract, nursery's growing it for you for a specific outcome, then you would have in mind what those seedling characteristics should be as part of your contract.
And so sort of give those specifications of what you're expecting.
And if they don't meet those specifications, either the season's been a very bad one for growth and the seedlings are too small, then you don't take them. You say, right, I want to hold those for another season so they get the height. And if they don't meet the characteristics at all for root system development, where they're pot bound, the top's out of proportion to the root system, or vice versa, then you don't take them at all. So what you're trying to do in there is to improve the game.
Process of elimination, really.
Yeah. So you're probably paying good money. At the moment you're paying over what I would call over the odds for most native seedlings from a nursery. So you want them to grow. Don't take poor seedlings. Take good seedlings. Encourage the nursery to throw away bad seedlings.
Yeah. So when we're talking about if the seedlings are kind of too close together, they might shoot up too tall, trying to get that competition for the light. So would you kind of recommend in that case that you'd space them, you'd fill every second pot in the tray?
That's what they do or have done in the Scion nursery, which is a good way of giving seedling space. They may want to grow tall, but you want as much foliage on them as possible so that when they go out into the field, there's plenty of leaf area to photosynthesize over into and what have you. So it's a good way of doing it. If the nursery is a small nursery, they will probably want to be cramming seedlings together just to make up numbers. Have a general look around a nursery when you first go in there. Get a feel for what the seedlings look like, as to whether you think they're good seedlings, whether you think you'll keep good seedlings.
If they're cramming everything into one area?
Yeah, it's suggestive that they either had a good take on some seedlings or that they're not selling that particular species that season. And there's all sorts of trends go on with what people want. But just have a general look around and get a feel for what the nursery's doing. Small nurseries aren't necessarily bad nurseries. Sometimes that means that the person is more into what they're doing. They've got the kaupapa that they're following. Big commercial nurseries, on the other hand, they're selling lots of seedlings. There's lots of turnover and they have a reputation to maintain as well. So there's kind of pros and cons as to what you're looking at and what you're looking for.
Yeah, but number one is make sure you have a look around first.
Yeah, and get a feel for your seedlings.
So we're going to have another episode where we talk about eco-sourcing and provenance. Just for the purposes of this episode and for a bit of context, what does eco-sourcing mean and how do you do it and why would you do it?
Eco-sourcing is where you take or collect seedlings from or collect material from that you want to turn into seedlings. It's usually either defined by a ecological boundary or maybe a catchment or potentially a cultural boundary. So you're looking to try and maintain the history of that plant and return it either back to the place that it came from so that the genetics are much the same as what they were coming out, so that in the future you're trying to maintain whatever genetic variety or variation there may be. There are ways and means of thinking about how far that should go, because pollen travels from most species, and particularly tall species, and species growing on ridgelines and mountaintops or mountain crests, their pollen can go for quite a long distance. So it's really up to the person who's collecting what they're using it for and what their aspirations are for the area that they've collected from. The idea that you're maintaining the variation or sometimes even the narrow variation that's within maybe a genetic population, because realistically we don't know much about most of the genetic variability within our native populations. That's a safety first approach, is to take from somewhere, grow it in a nursery and then return it to the place that you collected it from. The other alternative is to think about mixing genetic variability. For instance, taking tōtara from one site, growing it in the nursery and planting it into another site, so that you're trying to build up the variability that's introducing new variability to a site. There's pros and cons to that, and both answers and both sides to the question are right. It's really what the person is doing the planting for.
Yeah, so it's sort of in purpose or the cultural value or, yeah.
I mean, the reality is that species have moved around naturally for millennia. Humans have moved species around. So our ability to say that this particular seedling came from that site, has always come from that site, is getting harder and harder to do. For populations that are very narrow in their variability, so for instance some of the kakavik and the particular way they flower or the colour of the flowers, you may be wanting to try and protect that variation in the population. So that would be a case where you would be very cautious about introducing different variability to the population.
That might sort of cause a bit of hybridization, or maybe you'd lose that feature that you're really valuing.
Yeah, potentially that would be the outcome. But if you take it too far, then you could induce inbreeding.
Yeah.
And that brings its own problems and own risks to a population. So again, you've got to understand what it is you're trying to accomplish and how you might accomplish it.
Well, I guess for listeners, just to give a bit of context, we've had the red kakabek and the white kakabek, the ngintu kakama. And I think what had happened, I think they thought that it went extinct, the white kakabek, didn't it? And it kind of grew really often in gullies or valleys or near rivers. And I think there was that assumption that maybe when Cyclone Bowler came through, that it kind of took out the remnants of that population. And then there was an old dock worker, I think, who had passed, and I might have the story wrong, but I think his nephew had found an envelope with some seeds from like 20 years ago or something like that. Well, it would be even longer now. But essentially, they were given to the Scion nursery to grow. And I believe that out of like 72 seeds, they had 5 that came out. And we then had this conversation of, wow, that's not a lot of genetic diversity. You know, they might be really closely related. And depending on where they were picked up from, there's a good chance they're closely related. So it was a really tough question of, okay, what do we do now? Do we look into hybridization? And of course, we put that to iwi hapu to decide. But yeah, it's certainly a challenge with genetic diversity. In your opinion, what does good ethics look like for seed sourcing these days?
I think initially, from my perspective, coming from Indigenous forestry, a true forestry, growing, planting and cutting down, the ethics is looking for the best possible plants with the best growth rates and as much of the characteristics that you're looking for the outcome. Now, other people, it will be just good quality seedlings at the best price to achieve a cover or allow them to achieve a cover over the phenol that maybe has been missing for a long time. The ethics of it is driven by the outcome, and it will be through all of these potential outcomes. But for me, I'm looking for fast growth, straightness, good wood characteristics, preferably the heartwood characteristics that we know from old growth trees that we've grown up, or some of us have grown up using and being familiar with. Yeah, ethics is it's a very subjective kind of thing, and it's a bit of a movable feast. So it's kind of the eye of the beholder to some extent.
And And I guess thinking about ethics in another way, if we were to think about it from a human perspective, with seed collections done in the 70s and 80s, we did it a very different way. Nowadays, I guess people might get a little bit nervous that there's more red tape around it, or that you have to ask for permission from mana whenua and all those kinds of things. The process does take a bit longer than it used to take. But from my perspective, I think it probably should have always taken that long to make sure you're getting those processes in place to ask, hey, is this okay? And, this is what we're going to use it for, and maybe we can give you some back. Or, yeah, what's your kind of take on that?
Well, the reality for me, when I first started doing this back in the 70s, was that we didn't know to ask. The landowner for us was the government in most cases. Where we were going into parks and reserves, that was the local council. Where we were going on to known private land, it was go and knock on the door.
Landowner.
Go and ask the landowner. But where we were collecting for government-funded forestry projects, we were working on what was Crown land, Crown forests.
Mm-hmm.
As I indicated to one or two mana whenua groups just recently, when we were living in amongst their communities, we didn't know the name of the tribe, the name of the iwi, the name of the hapu.
You didn't know what you didn't know.
Yeah, it was a case of, well, we go and talk to the local forest ranger and get permission to do something, and they would say yes or no. Because we were at that stage, we were driven, and still are, by government direction as to what was the required outcome for that year or those number of years' science projects. So we were just following directions. Now that we know, then there's a lot more engagement from a government department perspective. Whether that drifts over into the private sector, I don't know. These days, cost is everything. Cost reduction is everything. The more time that is spent in engagement, that incurs a cost. That cost has got to be borne by the grower, and ultimately that passes on to the purchaser of the seedlings. There's costs and benefits. The benefits are that you find different places to collect seed from. You find different people to talk to who give you a different perspective and different information. They may tell you, I've been up the back of the property the last couple of weeks. Maybe they're familiar with the species you're trying to collect from. They say, there's nothing up there. Or there's loads up there, you go for it. Or, no, you can't go in there because these are special places for us. So don't go in there. So those are interesting things to talk to and talk about. And then you form relationships. And in years gone by, we've gone back to a lot of places and formed quite long-standing relationships with landowners, the iwi Māori or whether they're private Pākehā landowners. So it goes from knocking on the door and saying, excuse me, hi, I'm so-and-so, can we do this? To, kia ora, we're back again, can we have another look? And yeah, go for it, kind of thing. And that kind of brightens your day, makes things a lot more interesting.
Yeah, yep, I totally see what you mean. Something that I've seen as well working here, and I've worked with various groups who collect seed, and whether maybe it's for the Billion Trees projects or whatever, but it's with mana whenua groups collecting seed from their own backyard that they know which trees are the good producers, or they know which trees to avoid, or which areas are more accessible. And that pros and cons, it's quite cool to see people walking their own whenua and being able to contribute to the recloaking of their own whenua in that way as well. So on that note, that's all from us this week. Join us next time to discuss more on Indigenous forests and forestry in Aotearoa. Mauri ora.